Well, thank you for a moving and very clear perspective on a complex problem, exposing issues for our morality and for the world development of a failed state. So I now invite questions. Victoria, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Alan, for a brilliant presentation. Let me mention two little things and then ask you a concrete question. When I published my book, Morals and Politics in Germany, it came out in '97, I mentioned then, the book was finished in '96, that the most bloody conflict since the late '80s had been the conflict in Sudan, which almost nobody wanted to take cognizance of in Europe at the time. When you're asking politicians, what is the bloodiest conflict in the last 10 years, nobody knew it. And so I was very happy first when I came to the United States in '99 and I met evangelical students at Notre Dame who were acting on that. But I must confess you, already in the early 2000s, I developed a strange feeling when I was speaking with evangelical Christians because of a complete lack of knowledge when you were speaking with them. I mean, they had good feelings, they were noble persons, but when you ask them, how do you imagine the transition, they did not give you any answer. And so I began to become a little bit skeptical that these people would really lead to a better world. And for me, I think two lessons we can learn from this terrible and heart-wrenching conflict, three lessons from this heart-wrenching conflict. The first is, usually secession is not the solution. There is another state that was created in our new millennium by secession, it's Eritrea. And we don't want to enter into that case because even if it is not torn apart by civil war like South Sudan, the oppression of the people in Eritrea is not better than it was before the secession. So the strong doubts that people based on general reflections have against the principle of secession have been strengthened by these two new failed states. Second principle, which is extremely important, and it's hard to say, but it is unfortunately true. Kant, whom you underrate, by the way, but Kant once said that we have to accept for moral reasons the principle of allegiance to the government. Not because the government is good, but because the civil war that starts is a greater evil. It's a Hobbesian principle, but in the case of Kant, not based on rational self-interest, but on principle of the categorical imperative, which is a very different moral foundation. And again, the principle doesn't hold without restrictions. But I do think that to inculcate in the European populations in the 17th and 18th century the idea that usually by breaking off against the government, you cause more harm than good was very, very important. Of course, Americans have difficulties to understand this principle because their own country is based on a revolution, but it was a very, very different case since it was territorially separated, the bloodshed was quite minimal, and there was from the beginning a very realistic success chance to build up a new polity. This seems to me the big difference. The other point which I think is extremely important, and I'm very grateful that you are mentioning that, is the old Tarasti system, which we had already in the League of Nations when the League of Nations was started. And it still played a role in the Charter of the United Nations. A system which, for example, I defend still in Morals and Politics, has lost its plausible applicability in the last 20 years. Kosovo was the last instance where we had something like this, but we don't have any realistic alternative to that. And to insist that benevolent paternalism, because the trusteeship is based in idea of benevolent paternalism, is better than leaving a country to beasts, is something that we should defend. And I'm very grateful that you're addressing that. And the last point, forgive me if I make it, but the moving picture of Pope Francis kissing the feet of the bandits, as you rightly called them, reminded me of the complexity in which Victor Hugo, in Les Miserables, at the end of the work, gives us a cautionary reading that the beginning of the work doesn't apply always. The beginning is a wonderful scene when Bishop Myriel whose candelabra has been stolen by Valjean, when he's brought to him by the police, takes a second candelabra and said, but you forgot to take this one, which was my other gift to you. And this is a transforming experience, and I have no doubt that this is what the Pope hopes. But at the end, there is, in a mirror image to that, the situation where this horrific brother innkeeper, who is the worst person, gets money from Marius, who misunderstands him, and it is mentioned, what does he do with the money? He invests it in slave trade. So we must understand that even if the principle of Christianity to show trust is reasonable, there are situations where toughness is the only Christian response acceptable. Because if we give money to bandits, they will use it in hiring the next slave soldiers for their own purpose. So thank you for the moral principles that inspired your work.
Thank you, Vittorio, for giving me an entire agenda to revise my paper. But you did inspire me to incorporate Les Miserables. Well, first of all, I really appreciated your point about the problem of independence or separation or fracturing. That is absolutely, I think, appropriate and accurate. And in fact, what is fascinating is that John Garang, from the beginning, did not envision an independent South Sudan. He was actually a high-level military commander in Sudan. He basically started the rebellion because he felt that they were being oppressed. But he had a doctrine he called Sudanism, by which he meant he envisioned a country. Now, this probably was unrealistic, but he envisioned a new Sudan that would have been secular and multi-ethnic and pluralist and democratic. So John Garang, who was the most educated, the most sophisticated, the most worldly of the sort of the rebel figures in South Sudan, actually had a vision that the country would not split off. And had he stayed as president from 2005 on, it is possible, I don't know, it is possible he could have created much greater autonomy, federalism, and so forth for South Sudan without breaking away. And he was actually, in 2005, appointed vice president of Sudan. And when he was appointed, millions of people in the streets of Khartoum celebrated. So there was a sense in which he was not just a figure in the South, he was actually a major figure in Sudanese politics. And what we're seeing today with the collapse, with Bashir's leaving and the tremendous protests, there was, in a sense, some confidence in him, not just on the part of the people in the South, but others in the people of the North in Khartoum, that John Garang might be a transformative figure. So he actually did not want independence. But as soon as he died, his successors all pressed for independence. And the Catholic Relief Services folks I talked with knew it was premature. They didn't want it to happen, but they couldn't stop it, so then they just tried to make it peaceful. But the people I talked with said, no, South Sudan is not ready for independence, but we can't stop it, because there was no one who could do that. Now, with respect to your other point about the naivete of the evangelicals especially, I must say that I agree with that, and I think that as someone who, as a scholar, I actually became part of the movement I was documenting. I actually wrote op-eds about the, raising awareness. So I charge myself, in a sense, for some of that naivete. I don't think it was just the evangelicals. I think many of the advocates, from the Black Caucus to Catholic advocates to Jewish advocates, so identified with the people of South Sudan, they began to identify with the Sudan People's Liberation Army. But if you talk with church leaders in South Sudan and bishops, they always kept a distance from the rebel army because they saw it for what it was. It was useful, it was understandable, but it was not something that they wanted to celebrate, in a sense. So I think that's accurate. And what bothers me, and what I feel convicted to try to address, is the virtual silence in that advocacy community now. In other words, it was a dramatic, and you might say Manichaean, or I'm trying to think. There was a sense of clarity, moral clarity. The southern Sudanese African population were besieged by a scorched earth genocidal policy. We were trying to defend them. But once then South Sudan becomes independent and the politics becomes messier, there were multiple vortices, not just these two sides. A lot of the Nuer and others never joined the SPLA, so there were all kinds of militias. Once that happened, once independence happened, and then the Civil War, and it became clear that there was tremendous moral ambiguity all over the place, the advocacy community vanished because it didn't have that great moral clarity anymore. So I think we need to say, in a sense, we are partly responsible. We have a responsibility to protect. And I'm not sure I addressed all of your questions, but that's some of them.
We have a question from Professor Guan. Thank you.
Thank you. I read this paper with great interest and care because there's some resemblance to the situation in other part of the group between Hong Kong and China. In fact, the Catalonian movement organization has written to our independence advocate groups. Now, my question. In the second paragraph on page 39, toward the middle, you seem to have proposed a solution to these kinds of conflict. If I may read out, the reason like this. If the political community is not to be torn apart, while everyone follows his own opinion, there must be an authority to direct the energies of all citizens toward the common good, good enough, not in a mechanical or despotic fashion, but by acting above all as a moral force, gray, which appeals to everyone's freedom and sense of responsibility. So far, so good. But how can we really weave such an authority? Because in political science, there's a very famous dictum called the iron law of oligarchy. Who speaks of organization speaks of oligarchy. It could be very democratic in the beginning, with the common good in mind. But as time goes on, it will become an oligarch that reap all benefits from productive efforts of the state. That's my question. How can we overcome the iron law of oligarchy?
I'm delighted I'm getting such easy questions from my Pontifical Academy members. Well, thank you, Professor Kwan. And in a sense, what I found fascinating as I was struggling through this paper is I began to return to, much earlier works of scholarship. Samuel Huntington's Political Order and Changing Societies, for example, it came to mind because in a sense he said, look, the fundamental divide is not between democratic and oligarchic states, it's between order and chaos, order and anarchy. And you have to have fundamental order first before then you can cultivate civil society participation, education, and so forth. And I've never traveled to a place that was so bereft of any kind of functioning government, order, even just physical infrastructure. And so in a sense, the problem is not oligarchy. The problem is anarchy. And I mean, that's why I say what is created in South Sudan is a Hobbesian nightmare. It's a war of all against all. It's not just two factions. It's multiple vortices, multiple militias with their agendas and so forth. And so I don't know how to answer the question of how to address oligarchy, but at some level, some functional oligarchy would have been better than what we have now. In fact, I've heard people tell me that in some respects the situation is worse than it was during the war with Khartoum, because there's no order. So I think that, I'm not sure that's an answer to your question goes to the heart of governance, but it seems to me you need to have some functioning order. Before then, you can cultivate over time the institutions of a functioning pluralist democracy. And the fascinating thing is that the churches in South Sudan have the potential to do that, but they've been so devastated themselves by the wars and the strife and just dealing with the huge wounds of people. I mean, the people of South Sudan are just a shattered people. They are traumatized by so much war and now strife. They do not have sort of the mental capacity to govern.
Okay, we've got one quick question. Paulo, if you can make it quick.
John, in light of the time, I'd be happy to defer my question to the general discussion this afternoon.
That would be helpful. I think I'll move on if it's okay for everyone. We can have a discussion later on in the day or over the coffee break.
Let me just make one point. Yep. As you'll note on my paper, I do stress that this is a really early draft. This is a fast-moving development, and I'll be happy to not only send it to the Academy when it's revised, but I'll be happy to send it to be passed along to you all.
Thank you very much. So we move now to China, and Professor Wan has got the floor in terms of discussing China's perspectives, nationalism, imperialism, and indeed, or global visions. Thank you.